All right, ready to dig in. Today, we're diving deep into a fascinating piece of legislation from the Philippines. Republic Act number 6657, also known as the Comprehensive Agrarian Reform Law of 1988. Now, I know land reform might not sound like the most thrilling topic,
Right. Not exactly a page turner.
but trust me on this one. This act is about way more than just dividing up plots of land. It's about reshaping an entire nation.
Absolutely. It really is a pivotal piece of legislation, and to fully grasp its significance, we need to rewind a bit. Before we even get to 1988, we need to understand the historical context, the lay of the land, so to speak.
Okay, so set the scene for me. What was the situation in the Philippines leading up to this act?
For centuries, the Philippines had a deeply entrenched system of land ownership that was, to put it mildly, unequal.
Unequal how? Paint me a picture.
Imagine vast estates, sometimes thousands of hectares, controlled by a tiny fraction of the population. These landowners, they held immense power, both economically and politically.
Okay, I'm starting to see where this is going. And on the flip side, you had...
The majority of Filipinos, they were either working these vast estates as tenant farmers, sharecroppers, or they were landless laborers, often trapped in these cycles of poverty with very little opportunity for advancement.
So you're talking about a massive gap between the haves and the have-nots.
Exactly. And this disparity, this concentration of land and wealth in the hands of a few, it created all sorts of social and economic problems.
Yeah.
It's not surprising that there were calls for change.
Right, it sounds like something had to give.
It did, and there were attempts at land reform before 1988. In fact, throughout the 20th century, various administrations tried to tackle this issue. But these earlier reforms often fell short.
What went wrong?
Sometimes they lacked the scope, sometimes they didn't have the teeth, the enforcement mechanisms to really create lasting change.
So they weren't able to break that historical cycle.
Exactly. And that's where Republic Act Now 6657 comes in.
Mm-hmm.
This time, things felt different. There was a real sense that this act was going to be a game changer.
Okay, so let's talk about the act itself. Now, the full title is a bit of a mouthful. An act instituting a comprehensive agrarian reform program to promote social justice and industrialization, providing the mechanism for its implementation and for other purposes.
It's a mouthful, but it really sets the stage. You can tell right from the title that they were serious, that they weren't messing around.
Yeah, they even threw in that "and for other purposes" at the end, just to cover all their bases.
Right. And anything else we decide along the way.
Exactly. But what I find really interesting is this pairing of social justice and industrialization. There seem like kind of different goals, even potentially at odds with each other. How did they see those two things working together?
It's a fascinating balance they were trying to strike. They recognized that simply redistributing land, while important, wouldn't be enough. They wanted to create a more just and equitable society, yes, but they also wanted to boost the entire agricultural sector, modernize it, and use that as a springboard for broader economic development for industrialization.
So it wasn't just about giving land to the landless, it was about transforming the entire system.
Precisely. They envisioned a future where farmers were empowered, where they were true stakeholders in the agricultural economy, not just working the land, but owning it, managing it, and reaping the benefits.
A complete overhaul, not just a quick fix.
Exactly. And underpinning this entire act, this whole vision, is this really interesting concept. The idea that land has a social function.
Okay, I've heard that phrase before, but I'll be honest, it's always seemed a bit vague to me. How do they define that? What does it actually mean in this context?
Essentially, it means recognizing that land ownership isn't just an individual right. It comes with responsibilities. It means recognizing that land should be utilized for the benefit of society as a whole, not just for individual gain.
So it's not just about who owns the land, but how that land is being used.
Exactly. The act emphasizes making the land productive, ensuring that it's used to its full potential, that it's contributing to the nation's well-being.
So not punishing landowners, but making sure the land is being used in a way that benefits everyone. All right, this act was incredibly detailed, so let's get into the specifics. Who were they targeting with this, and what kinds of land were they looking at?
They cast a pretty wide net in terms of the land that was included. Public lands, private lands, even those under specific categories like agricultural leases. Basically, if it was being used for agriculture in some way, it was potentially on the table.
Okay, so a pretty broad definition of agricultural land. And who were they hoping to empower with this act?
They were very clear on this point. The priority was on the people who actually worked the land, the ones who relied on agriculture for their livelihood. Tenant farmers, sharecroppers, regular and seasonal farm workers, they were at the top of the list.
It makes sense to prioritize those who are most directly impacted by the existing system.
Exactly. They were trying to address that historical imbalance, to give those who had been marginalized under the old system a real chance to become landowners themselves.
Yeah.
But they also had to acknowledge the reality of existing landowners, right? I mean, you can't just take people's property without some kind of system in place.
Right. There has to be a balance.
Exactly. That's where this concept of retention limits comes in. It was all about finding that sweet spot between redistribution and protecting the rights of those who already owned land.
Retention limits, break that down for me. What does it actually mean in practice?
So picture this. You're a landowner. You've got, say, 10 hectares of prime rice growing land. Under these retention limits, you might be able to keep, I don't know, maybe 5 hectares for yourself.
Okay, so half in that case.
But then you've got someone else who owns 100 hectares, but it's less suitable for prime crops. Maybe it's more hilly or something. They might be allowed to retain a smaller percentage, maybe only 15 or 20 hectares.
So it wasn't a one-size-fits-all approach. They took the quality and productivity of the land into account when determining how much an owner could keep.
Absolutely. They recognized that a viable farm in one region might be a different size than a viable farm in another region, depending on all sorts of factors like soil quality, irrigation, what types of crops you can grow there.
So they were trying to make sure that the land that was being redistributed could actually support families, that it could create a more sustainable agricultural system.
Exactly. They weren't just trying to break up large estates for the sake of it. They wanted to create farms that could actually thrive.
That's a really important point. It wasn't just about land ownership in the abstract. It was about creating a system where those farms could be productive, where they could contribute to the economy.
Absolutely. And they even had special provisions for the children of landowners, allowing them to retain a certain amount of land under specific conditions. I think it was an attempt to, maybe ease some anxieties, make it clear that this wasn't about punishing anyone, but about creating a more equitable system for everyone.
It's interesting. It sounds like they were trying to find ways to ensure generational continuity as well, to make sure that the next generation wasn't completely left out of the equation.
Yeah, definitely. It adds a whole other layer of complexity, doesn't it?
It does. But let's talk about the rollout of this whole thing. I mean, you can't just flip a switch and redistribute millions of hectares of land overnight. Did they have a plan for how they were going to actually implement this?
They did. They knew that such a massive undertaking had to be done strategically, step by step. And that's where this idea of phased implementation comes in.
Okay, so tell me about these phases. How do they break it down?
Imagine it like rolling out a new software update, right? You wouldn't just release it to every single user at once, would you?
No way. Not if you want to keep your job.
Exactly. There could be bugs, unintended consequences. You got to work out the kinks first. So you do it in stages, right? You start with a smaller group, maybe your beta testers, you get feedback, and you gradually expand the rollout.
So they basically treated land reform like a giant beta test.
In a way, yeah. They wanted to make sure the transition was as smooth as possible, that they weren't going to throw the entire agricultural sector into chaos. So they divided the implementation into 3 phases.
Okay, 3 phases. Walk me through it. What was phase 1?
Phase 1, this focused on land that was, for lack of a better term, low-hanging fruit. Lands that were already partially covered by previous reforms, specifically rice and corn lands.
Okay, so starting with what they already knew.
Yeah. They also targeted idle or abandoned lands, lands that were voluntarily offered up by owners, and any land that had been acquired by the government.
So they started with the areas where there was likely to be the least resistance, where they could demonstrate some early success and build momentum.
Exactly. Show that they were serious, that this wasn't just talk. Then came phase 2, which actually kicked in around the same time as phase 1. This phase broadened the scope significantly. They started including all other public agricultural lands and any private lands that were larger than 50 hectares.
So the larger estates were next on the list. Made sense to tackle those early on, given the scale of the issue.
Absolutely. Now, you might be wondering about those smaller farms, the ones below 50 hectares.
I was just about to ask, were they exempt? Did they escape the reach of the reform?
They didn't escape entirely. Phase 3, this is where they tackled those remaining private agricultural lands. They started with holdings that were above 24 hectares and then steadily worked their way down to the smaller ones. Eventually, even farms that were just above the retention limit were included.
So even those smaller farms, the ones that might have seemed safe at first, eventually fell under the umbrella of the Act. It really was comprehensive. But I have to imagine that figuring out who got what land, how much they got, where it went. That must have been incredibly complicated.
Oh, absolutely. This wasn't just a free-for-all. They had to come up with a system for prioritizing beneficiaries, making sure it was fair and transparent.
So walk me through that. Who was first in line? Who got first dibs on the redistributed land?
Right at the top of the list were the people who had the most direct connection to the land itself. We're talking tenant farmers, the ones who had been working someone else's land for years, maybe even generations. Sharecroppers, regular and seasonal farm workers, they were all given priority.
Makes sense. It's about recognizing their historical relationship with the land, right? Giving them a chance to become landowners themselves.
Exactly. But here's where it gets interesting. Simply being landless wasn't enough. The Act specifically states that beneficiaries had to demonstrate a willingness, an aptitude, and the ability to actually cultivate the land effectively.
So you couldn't just be like, I don't own any land, give me some. You had to show that you were actually going to put it to good use.
Exactly. They weren't just trying to create a nation of hobby farmers. They wanted people who were serious about agriculture, who were committed to making the land productive and contributing to that vision of a stronger agricultural sector.
So they were looking for people who had the skills, or at least the willingness to learn the skills, to be successful farmers.
Exactly. And to prevent the problem of land concentration from just repeating itself, they implemented something called an award ceiling.
An award ceiling? What's that?
It's pretty straightforward, actually. No matter where you fell on that list of beneficiaries, no matter how much land you'd worked previously, you couldn't receive more than 3 hectares of agricultural land.
3 hectares, that's what, about 7.5 acres? It's not nothing, but it's not exactly a massive estate either.
Exactly. And that was the point. They weren't trying to create a new class of large landowners. They were trying to create a more equitable system where farms were of a manageable size, where families could realistically work the land and thrive without relying on hired labor.
So it was about breaking that cycle of dependency, empowering people to be self-sufficient, but also preventing the concentration of land ownership from just happening all over again.
Exactly. Now, I know what you're thinking.
hmm
What about the original landowners? What happened to them in all of this? Did they just get pushed aside?
That's a good question. We talked about how much land they could keep, but what about compensation for the land they had to give up?
That was a major part of the act as well. They understood that you can't just take someone's property without fairly compensating them. So they mandated something called just compensation for any land that was acquired for redistribution.
Just compensation sounds simple enough, but I'm sure it was anything but. How do you even begin to calculate something like that? Was it just based on, like, market value?
It was more nuanced than that. While market value was definitely a factor, they also took into account things like the land's current use, the income it was generating, even its historical and social significance.
Okay, so a piece of land that had been in a family for generations that might have had some kind of cultural or historical value that it might be valued differently than, say, a plot of land that someone had just bought recently as an investment.
Exactly. They recognized that land often carries a lot of weight, a
Mm.
lot of personal and cultural significance, and they tried to account for that in the compensation process.
That's actually pretty remarkable. It just shows a sensitivity to the complexities of land ownership that you don't always see in these types of reforms.
It does. And to make that transition a little bit smoother, they offered landowners several different modes of compensation. They could choose to receive straightforward cash payments, or they could opt for shares of stock in government-controlled corporations.
Hmm.
They could even receive physical assets or other qualified investments.
So it wasn't just a case of, here's your check, goodbye. They had some options.
They did. And to encourage cooperation, to sweeten the deal a bit, they even offered an incentive.
Oh, yeah. Like what?
Any landowner who voluntarily offered their land for sale, they got an additional 5% cash bonus on top of whatever the agreed-upon compensation was.
That's pretty smart. Incentivize rather than penalize. Makes sense.
It does. It creates a sense of, we're all in this together. We're all trying to build a better future. It's not about winners and losers.
Right. It's about finding a path forward that works for everyone.
Exactly. But of course, implementing a plan this big, this ambitious, even with the best intentions, it was never going to be easy. There were bound to be challenges along the way.
I'm sure. When is anything this complicated ever smooth sailing? What were some of the hurdles they encountered?
Well, one of the biggest challenges, and this is something that often gets overlooked in land reform efforts, is the question of support. It's one thing to redistribute the land, but it's another thing entirely to make sure that the new landowners, especially those who had never owned land before, had the tools and the knowledge they needed to be successful.
It's like you've been a tenant farmer your whole life, you've always answered to someone else, and suddenly you're handed the deed to this plot of land and told, okay, go make it work. Where do you even begin?
Exactly. Farming is hard work, it's risky, you need more than just land, you need knowledge, you need skills, you often need access to things like credit and markets.
So what did they do? Did they just leave these new landowners to fend for themselves?
No, they actually put a lot of thought into this, which
Hmm.
I have to say really impressed me when I was researching this. They dedicated an entire chapter of the Act to what they called support services.
Support services. Okay, I like the sound of that already. But was this like actual tangible support or just, a bunch of pamphlets and a pat on the back?
Oh no, this is the real deal. They offered a whole range of support services because they realized that true agrarian reform, it's not just about handing over a piece of paper, it's about empowering these new farmers to succeed.
Okay, color me intrigued. What did this support actually look like on the ground?
So picture this. You're a new farm owner, right? You've spent your whole life working someone else's land, and now you've got your own plot.
Yeah.
One of the first things you need is a clear understanding of your boundaries, right? Knowing exactly what land is yours.
Makes sense. Can't exactly start planting if you don't know where your farm begins and ends.
Exactly. So one of the first things they offered were land surveys and titling services. They wanted to make sure these new landowners had clear, legal ownership from day one, avoid any disputes down the line.
Smart. A solid foundation, literally.
But what about the actual business of farming? Did they just assume everyone knew what to do?
Not at all. They provided access to credit facilities, recognizing that starting a farm, it takes capital. And these weren't your typical bank loans either. They came with much more flexible terms, specifically designed to meet the needs of small-scale farmers.
Okay, so helping them secure the funds to get started, what about the actual know-how?
That was covered too. They had these agricultural extension services that provided extensive training. Imagine workshops, field schools, where experienced agricultural professionals would teach everything from modern farming techniques to crop selection, pest control, even post-harvest handling.
Wow, they really did think of everything. It sounds like they were giving these new landowners the tools and the knowledge they needed to not just survive, but to actually thrive. That was the goal. And it wasn't just about individual farms either. They also encouraged these new landowners to consider collective ownership models, like forming cooperatives or entering co-ownership arrangements.
Interesting. So instead of everyone just going it alone, they were encouraged to work together.
Exactly. That way, they could pool resources, share knowledge, potentially achieve greater economies of scale. It was about fostering a spirit of community and collaboration, recognizing that they were stronger together.
I love that, lifting each other up. But we've talked a lot about the beneficiaries. What about the former landowners? Were they just left to fend for themselves?
Not at all. Remember that whole idea of dual focus we talked about earlier? That applied to the support services as well. They recognized that the former landowners were also going through a major transition, and they needed guidance and support too.
It's about finding a way forward for everyone, not just shifting the power dynamic from one group to another.
Exactly. For the former landowners, the support focused on helping them transition to other economic activities. They wanted to channel the capital and the resources that were once concentrated in land ownership into other sectors of the economy.
So, encouraging diversification, moving away from this heavy reliance on agriculture. Smart move if you're trying to build a more resilient economy.
Exactly. They offered investment information, counseling services. They even helped landowners convert those bonds they received as compensation into other types of investments.
Wow, so they really were invested in making this work for everyone involved, not just checking boxes.
They were. But let's be real. Implementing something this massive, this complex, even with the best of intentions and a well-thought-out plan, it was never going to be perfect, right? There were bound to be challenges along the way.
Yeah, there's always a gap between theory and practice, between what's written on paper and how things actually play out in the real world.
Absolutely. And this was a massive undertaking. We're talking about millions of hectares of land, millions of people's lives being impacted. It was never going to be a simple, straightforward process.
So the million-dollar question, did it work? Did RA 6657 achieve those ambitious goals of social justice, a thriving agricultural sector, a more equitable Philippines?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And like most things in life, the answer isn't a simple yes or no. There were definitely successes.
Yeah.
Millions of hectares of land were redistributed. Tenant farmers who had never dreamed of owning their own land, they were given that opportunity. And the act did spur some degree of industrialization and diversification in the economy. So there were wins, for sure.
That's huge, but I'm sensing a but coming.
There's always a but, isn't there? The implementation wasn't always smooth, wasn't always consistent. There were bureaucratic hurdles. Sometimes funding fell short. And let's be honest, there was resistance from certain quarters, those who benefited from the old system.
Yeah, power dynamics are hard to shift, even with the best of intentions.
Exactly. And even with those support services, some beneficiaries struggled. Farming is inherently risky. You can do everything right and still have a bad harvest, so go bankrupt. Market fluctuations, access to infrastructure, the weather that fits, those can all make or break a farm, regardless of who owns it.
So it was a mixed bag. Successes, challenges, unintended consequences, the whole shebang.
That's a great way to put it. And that's what makes this such a fascinating case study, even today. RA 6657, it forces us to confront the realities of social change. It reminds us that even with the best intentions, the most well-crafted plans, transforming deeply rooted systems, it takes time, it takes constant adaptation, a willingness to learn from both the successes and the failures.
It's a reminder that there's no silver bullet, no single piece of legislation that can solve all of society's problems overnight.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to engage with these issues critically, to go beyond the headlines, to really delve into the nuances.
Don't just take our word for it, or anyone else's for that matter. Do your own digging, explore the different perspectives, come to your own conclusions about the legacy of RA 6667. What worked, what didn't, what lessons can we learn from this really ambitious attempt to reshape a nation?
Those are the questions we should all be asking, because ultimately understanding the past, that's how we navigate the present, that's how we shape a better future.
Beautifully said. And on that note, we've reached the end of our deep dive into the world of Philippine Land Reform and Republic Act number 6657. It's a story that's still being written, with ongoing debates about its impact, its successes, and its failures. What's clear is that this act, it represents a pivotal moment in Philippine history, one that continues to shape the relationship between land, power, and social equity. And it reminds us that these issues, they're not just confined to the Philippines, they're not just relics of the past.
Exactly. Wherever we are in the world, whenever we're grappling with inequality, with access to resources, with the very foundations of who benefits from land ownership, the story of RA 6657, it has something to teach us.
It encourages us to think critically, to ask tough questions, to engage in those meaningful conversations about how we create a more just and equitable world for everyone. So keep those questions coming, stay curious, and never stop exploring. Our deep dive might be over for today, but the learning never ends.